see this? Call the Broken Arrow Municipal Authority special meeting to order. Roll call. Thank you.
Green.
Here.
Ford.
Here.
Parks. Gillespie.
Here.
Wimpy.
Here. First item on the general authority business is 3A, consideration, discussion, and possible approval of Grand River Water Supply Study Alternatives Recommendation. Ethan. You are not Kenny, you are Ethan.
I am. Good evening, Authority, Madam Chairperson, Vice Chair, Trustees, Mr. Spurgeon, Ethan Edwards, Director of Engineering and Construction for the City of Broken Arrow. So, a little history here. Back in August of 2021, staff made a presentation to the Authority regarding the long-range study that was completed by HDR back in 2017. The purpose of the staff's presentation was to obtain authorization to proceed with this Grand River water study to evaluate alternatives for a second water source, including phasing options for a potential long-term project, which we did bring that contract with HDR back to the Authority, I believe, in March of 2022. Tonight we have Joel Cantwell and Christy Shaw with HDR. They're here with us to help present the findings of the study. As you may recall, HDR was the consultant for the water treatment plant, and they have been a long-term partner with both the city and the Authority. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Schwab to give a little bit of history on the project.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening. So the history of Broken Arrow Water has been going on for quite some time. And if we go ahead and go to the PowerPoint, this is a PowerPoint that HDR consultant has put together, and I get the fun stuff. I get the first two slides and then tell me to sit down. So if we go to the history line, the timeline, our first real water in Broken Arrow came from Ray Harold, the springs. Everybody knows Broken Arrow's history on the springs. There's a little pond lake out there, if you will. And we built a pump house in 1909. That was our first bond as a community, a revenue bond. So 1909, we built a pump house and pumped 500,000 gallons a day to a water tank that stood about where Mr. Spurgeon's office is. That tank was basically served our water supply until 1967. Broken Arrow Expressways opened up, our population's blowing up, and in 1967, obviously we started the design a few years ahead of time. We designed a new water treatment plant, opened it actually in January of 67, 4 million gallons a day. Our population took off quickly, and by 1976, we needed more water. The plant was overstressed. In 1970, we were 11,787, I believe. In 1980, we were 35,761. So you can see the big growth in there. We already had our first plant expansion 9 years into it and moved it up to 10 million gallons. At the same time, that's when disinfection byproducts were discovered in 74, and they began to get regulated. We were still growing. We switched from a treatment plant at the Verdigris River and then became a purchased water system. We'd enter into I believe it was a 31-year agreement with UWA. And by the way, we do have members of UWA here tonight. We'll introduce them a little bit later. But we entered into a 31-year agreement to purchase treated water. So they were treating it at their water treatment plant. They're just outside of Pryor in the Mid-America Industrial Park and sending it to us. By 1982, January, we took the water and we were on that until 2014. So back up about 10 years earlier, maybe 11 years earlier, we started doing a long-range plan. What are we going to do for our citizens of Broken Arrow? So you can see it takes a while to get to that end result. And we went through a citizen committee, we went through piloting, we went through design, review with DEQ and all the other permitting agencies, and we built a new plant, and it opened in April of 2014 at 20 million gallons a day. But we have a huge investment in that line that comes from UWA, Oklahoma Ordnance Waterworks Agency Authority, to us. Like I said, we built it in 1982 or built it before it became operational in 82. It's still in the ground. We are still owners of that line. What do we do with it? So even before the plant became operational in 2014, there was always a discussion, do we use it for raw water? Do we buy more treated water from UWA and supplement. How do we do this? So it's always been in the process in the back of our mind. And as Ethan said, in August of 2021, the governing body authorized us to enter into an agreement with HDR to take a look at how can we implement, what do we do with that next phase. So that's kind of where we are tonight with their contract. They're going to recommend what our next steps are. Next slide. So what are the drivers? As we said right now, we rely on one water source, a Verdigris River. We treat it. We have the ability. Actually, we've made an expansion to the plant since that timeline. We can actually treat up to 30 million gallons a day. So we have a 30 million gallon a day treatment plant on the Verdigris River, but we only have one source, no backup. We are tied into Tulsa, Tulsa Metropolitan Utility Authority. We have two major tie locations with them, one along 41st or Dearborn, probably about where Elm would go through if it went through. We have a tie-in there that comes into the north side of town. Then we have another tie-in with them really at let's see, that's Olive and Albany, 61st and 129th. We have a tie-in. So we can get treated water from Tulsa to help supplement. It's really a supplemental, and that's what it is intended to be. But what do we do moving forward with our investment? So that's what's on tap tonight. Some of the drivers I said is really the Verdigris River is a navigational channel. The furthest inland port in the United States is in Catoosa. With that port, it's about 97, 98% built out. A lot of industry, a lot of potential challenges for our water if there's a spill or a major contamination and we're down to one source, we would have to tie over to Tulsa to pick up theirs. That's one of the biggest issues. Adams Creek, which ties into right where we get our water out of the Verdigris, it's still kind of shallow. We have a lot of algae blooms, taste and odor. Knock on wood, we haven't had one since Charles Vokes started in September 5 years ago. That was our last major taste and odor issue. But it's not a fact of you're not going to have them. It's when's the next one. And it's really, truly driven by algae. Potential OWRB curtailment of existing water rights. So we're going to talk about the water rights here in a minute, and Christy Shaw from HDR will touch on that. So those are a lot of the big drivers. What's our need? We've already talked about it. Another source, redundant supply source line. So, and flexibility and water quality. Right now, the Grand River, Lake Hudson, where we'd be talking about getting water, HDR will talk about that water chemistry and how it's potentially better for us than the Verdigris and gives us some flexibility. So that's what's up tonight. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Christy Shaw.
Thank you, Kenny. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the water rights that the City of Broken Arrow currently has, and then I'm also going to give an update on the demand projections. As part of the study that we recently did, we looked at forecasting those demand projections out to 2070. I'm going to talk a little bit about the existing water rights. Yes, 2070, it's a long way away.
We won't be here, but
Setting up for future success, right?
Mhm.
So right now there are two water rights on the Verdigris River, gallons per day, with a max diversion of 30 MGD. And that 30 MGD coincides with your treatment plant capacity as well. Back when we did an initial study back in 2015 as part of the Long Range Water Supply Plan, we had identified a need for future water. And at that time, it coincided with the receipt of a letter from the Oklahoma Water Resources Board that basically said, we don't think you guys have been using all of your water rights. And on a 7 to 9 year basis, they review all of the water rights that are under their jurisdiction, and then they can recommend curtailment. And that also was around the same time frame that Broken Arrow made its very significant investment in your water treatment plant. So in response to that letter of curtailment potential, there was a request that was put in 2015, and that permit is still pending on the Verdigris. But that was for a average use of 15.8 MGD and a max diversion of 20 MGD. I'm going to talk a little bit about the agency coordination after I review just a couple of slides here. But we did reach out recently to OWRB and talk a little bit about the letter that had been issued that had been unresolved and kind of their take on that, as well as this third water right. You may recall that earlier this year, 10 Killer Ferry Lake, there was a permit that was basically released earlier this year. There were many reasons for that, including the fact of the distance that 10 Killer Ferry Lake was. Also, part of the reason why they were talking, OWRB hadn't gone forward with considering that third permit or the pending request was because they had cited the 10 Killer Ferry Lake permit and saying that there was enough water for Broken Arrow into the future. One thing about 10 Killer Ferry Lake that was a really important distinction is that even though you had a water right, that didn't have any storage that went behind it. So it was a run of the river rights, wasn't firm, and so that was released back in earlier this year. So the two water supply water rights that you have are the Verdigris River, and then also through contracted supplies receiving water from Tulsa. So this is kind of a messy and busy graph here, but I wanted to just kind of walk through it. This is the 2070 projections. The dashed lines are showing what your average day water use is anticipated to be now and moving onward to the future. The red line above it talks about the peak day. Roughly, take-home message is that in 2070, we're anticipating that your average day water use is going to be around 23 MGD. And your peak water use is going to be around 46 MGD. So in the previous slide, we showed, yep, we've got average day pretty much covered, but you don't have the peak day covered. And you want to be able to plan for those conditions moving forward. The background that you might see is the coloring is your current water supplies. So in the past, you relied on UWA treated supplies, and then in 2014, those were discontinued. There was a 36-inch line coming from UWA, and the city of Broken Arrow migrated towards using the Verdigris River solely and having your water treatment plant, and then expanding that treatment plant to 30 MGD. So it shows in the blue the Verdigris River water rights up to the 30 MGD, and then TMUA, the treated water of about 5 MGD on top of that. So what you'll notice is that between 2040 and 2050, you have a shortfall. Actually around like 2042 or so, you might be seeing that shortfall. So what we're doing today is we're going to frame and talk a little bit about what water supplies we evaluated in order to address that shortfall and give you guys some redundancy and reliability. So the agency coordination, this ended up being a really significant part of our study. We reached out to the Oklahoma Water Resources Board, inquired about the third permit, and that was still pending. That is still a pending status at this point. And they are wanting to see where the need is, basically. We did receive some good news that they were not actively seeking to curtail your first two water rights. And that's great news. It doesn't, however, protect you for the future necessarily. So it's working now, and they see that there is a need for those water supplies moving forward, but because they have this cycle, that's going to be revisited in the future. So that communication and relationship continues forward. We also reached out to the Grand River Dam Authority. We